Well, I'm super excited to have you on the show, Dr. Meyer. Your appearance on Joe Rogan was obviously widely viewed, very popular, and a really, really interesting conversation that you guys had together. I want to sort of do like a debrief about that conversation or kind of dig into certain points that came up during that conversation on our time today. And I want to start by just saying this. If I type your name in on Google, Stephen C. Meyer, it says that Stephen C. Meyer is an American author and former educator. He is an advocate of the pseudoscience of intelligent design. And I just think that that's interesting right out of the gate. And I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that idea. Why is it referred to as a pseudoscience, intelligent design?
Notice the term itself, pseudoscience, implies a definition of what presumably true science is. And this is in the philosophy of science known as the demarcation problem. How do you define science and distinguish it from pseudoscience or philosophy or religion or metaphysics or something else? And it turns out that that's a very difficult thing to do because the methods of reasoning that are used in scientific disciplines are actually not dissimilar, and in some cases are the same as the methods of reasoning that are used in philosophy or metaphysics or historical work or forensic inquiry. So the term pseudoscience is obviously a pejorative. It's meant to stigmatize someone without actually engaging in the person's arguments. But the presumed definition of science that is underlying that term and its use on the Wikipedia entry is that if you're to be a scientist, you must limit yourself to strictly materialistic explanations for everything. And you may not invoke intelligence or creative intelligence as a cause to explain anything. The reason they've designated me and other advocates of the theory of intelligent design as pseudoscientists is because they've presupposed a materialistic definition of science. There's a term in the philosophy of science for that definition. It's called methodological naturalism or methodological materialism. And it is a claim that, again, a normative claim that if you're to be scientific, you must not consider creative intelligence as an explanation for any phenomena. If you do, then you're going outside the scientific method and you're pseudoscientific. Well, that's a contentious definition of science. There are many fields that we recognize as scientific that invoke creative intelligence. If you're an archaeologist and you look at the Rosetta Stone in the British Museum, you're going to immediately infer that there was an intelligence involved in producing those inscriptions in 3 different languages. So we have methods by which we can detect the activity of intelligent agency. And what we're saying, those of us who are proponents of intelligent design are saying is that when we apply those methods of design detection to living systems, we actually see distinctive hallmarks of the activity of a designing mind that is empirically detectable. And so that question can't really be settled. Whether we're right or wrong can't be settled by simply saying, oh, well, that's not scientific, we're not going to consider that. What really needs to be considered is whether or not the evidence supports the inference we're making. And this is the problem with all the use of demarcation arguments and why philosophers of science have generally rejected them. If you want to define somebody's opinion out of existence by the use of some abstract definition, or if you want to define a theory or a perspective or an inference or a hypothesis out of existence, or to say it can't be considered by definition, you may end up missing the best explanation for the evidence because you've simply defined science too narrowly to exclude possibilities that are inconsistent with your own personal philosophy, the philosophy in this case of materialism.
Correct me if this is not the most helpful way of narrowing down into this, but for me, this distinction between mechanism and agency, I find very interesting. And what I mean by that, for those who maybe are listening and don't know what I mean, is that when it comes to materialist explanations of the functions of the universe, it's like looking at a car engine and saying, how does everything work? What are the mechanics of how they all work? But when it comes to the question, the broader question of agency. It's more so the question of how do these pieces fit together and where do the raw materials themselves come from. And I think it was John Lennox who said that agency and mechanism don't compete with each other. I guess I want to say that just to, and again, if anything that I said in there.
Let me make a little, give it a slightly different
Sure.
framing. I think you're onto something very important. There's an analytical distinction there. If you look at the car engine, you can evaluate, you can analyze how it works, and there is a mechanism there, many mechanisms at work, and you can do that without respect to agency. The pistons go up and down. They they cause the gases to combust. That causes movement in the axle, etc. And you can track all those different cause and effect relationships and describe them in strictly materialistic terms. But if you want to give an account of the origin of the mechanisms, the origin of the engine, you can't do that apart from the agency of the engineer. And so if you're asking questions about causal origins, as opposed to, if you ask questions about how does one part of the material world or the physical world interact with another, you're going to, the framing of the question means that you're going to give a materialistic answer. But if you have to ask a question about, well, what caused this entity or system or process to arise in the first place? It might be that it was the product of purely undirected material processes, but it might also be the case that it was the product of an agent manipulating or designing or arranging material processes or material entities. So agency may play a role. So if you ask what caused this thing to come into existence, one possible answer to that question is a mind. Another is purely undirected material processes. If you define science in advance so narrowly as to exclude the possibility of mind, you might miss the right answer. The evidence may be pointing in a blindingly obvious way to the activity of an intelligence, as it is with the Rosetta Stone, for example. And if you insist, well, no, I can only invoke undirected material processes to answer that question of causal origins, then you may end up saying something silly like, well, it looks like wind and erosion produced those inscriptions on the Rosetta Stone. And so when we see, for example, the digital information stored in the DNA molecule, and as scientists have elucidated what that information does, that it's part of a complex information storage, transmission, and processing system. And we begin to think about, well, what in our experience produces information? What produces information processing systems? And we realize that there is only one known cause of that kind of effect. And that cause involves agency. It involves intelligence, conscious activity. Is a great early information scientist who was at the forefront of applying informational analysis to molecular biology. And he said that the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. That's what we know from our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning. And so this gets back to your earlier question about the problem of labeling things pseudoscience, or saying that intelligent design is just not science, or it's religion, or it's metaphysics, or you put a label on it and think you've answered the argument. But the key question is, what is the best explanation of the evidence based on what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world? If we're asking a question about causal origins, we need to be open to the possibility of agency or intelligence as part or all of the answer. And we also need to be open to materialistic explanations as well. But defining science so it's limited to materialistic explanations means that you may make an inference to the best materialistic explanation, which is not the best explanation, in fact.
So when you were on the Joe Rogan Experience, you mentioned going to a conference that dealt with origin of life, origin of the universe, and origin of human consciousness, and that you walked away from that conference feeling that the sort of the high ground belonged to the theist as opposed to the materialist. I was really curious to hear, sort of, if you could, let's just start with origin of the universe. What are the different explanatory options for the origin of the universe, and why do you think that intelligence or an intelligent designer is the more reasonable option?
Well, I'd frame that issue. Well, that's fine. Let's dive in on that. The conference. It was early in my career. It was a conference that was discussing these three big issues at the intersection of science and philosophy, or science and religion. The question of the origin of the universe was the first issue up, and the conference was divided, interestingly, between very elite scientists who were either theists or materialists. And they were debating, well, what does our best evidence about the origin of the universe or the origin of life imply as to which of these different, these two competing philosophical systems of thought is the better one to hold? Which one provides a better explanation or provides a better sense of coherence to the data? And in the first session, the great American astrophysicist, an astronomer, Alan Sandage, ascended to the podium and surprised many people in the audience by sitting down on the theistic side of the panel. And it turns out that he had been he was an agnostic Jew who was a well-known scientific materialist, fairly hard-bitten scientific materialist through much of his career. He had been Edwin Hubble's PhD student. He was a grad student of Hubble's. And he had been for a couple of decades involved in verifying the expansion of the universe in all quadrants of the night sky. And so in his talk, he gave a talk about the evidence for what we now call the Big Bang theory and the evidence that the universe had a beginning, and reflected on that evidence rather poignantly, pointing out that the evidence we have for a beginning from multiple, and there are multiple lines of such evidence, suggested that the material universe itself had a beginning, before which there was no matter to do the causing. If matter itself comes into existence at a finite time ago, then positing a prior material state to explain the origin of matter is self-contradictory. And instead he said, you know, what we're looking at, he said, here is evidence for what can only be called a supernatural event. And there was a beat between the word super and natural. And he was, you know, he then went on to reflect on this and announced that he had had a religious conversion, and that the scientific evidence about the beginning of the universe, about the fine-tuning of the universe, and some other things actually were influences in his coming to theistic belief. It was not because of, but it was not in spite of these evidences. It was in part because of them. He also realized there was something inside himself, which he described very, again, poignantly, that was reluctant to consider the possibility of a transcendent intelligence as the cause of the universe. But then he realized it might be the better explanation. So why am I so resistant to this? It was a fascinating discussion. Anyway, there are several different cosmological models, but the two main are the standard Big Bang theory and the inflationary cosmological model. Both of them affirm that the universe had a beginning. There are multiple lines of evidence supporting that, from observational astronomy, the redshift evidence that the light from distant galaxies is being stretched out, indicating that the galaxies themselves are moving away. There's the evidence of the cosmic background radiation. There's been additional observations about anomalies within the cosmic background radiation. They're also explained by the standard Big Bang. On Joe Rogan, I talked about the new evidence that's come in from the James Webb telescope, which was initially falsely reported as challenging the idea that the universe was expanding outward from a beginning. But as I discussed, I had I think about a 14-minute clip that the Rogan people put up where I explained why the James Webb data is actually confirming the picture of the universe we've had, of a universe that's expanding outward from a beginning point. I've had two separate astrophysicists, one at the University of Washington and one at University of California, San Diego, communicate with me subsequently to affirm that, yes, you got that right. That's what we astrophysicists think. So there's lots of evidence from astrophysical and astronomical evidence, but there are also two really compelling proofs or mathematical results based on theoretical physics that are also, in one case, highly suggestive of a beginning, and in the other case, pretty definitive proof of a beginning. I'm referring to first the singularity theorems of Hawking and Penrose and Ellis from the late 60s and early 70s that I think are at least highly suggestive of a beginning. There's a loophole. There's a way of getting around their proof of an absolute singularity, but it involves something that I think has called quantum cosmology, which I think has theistic implications for other reasons. And then there's another proof based on special relativity, the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which I think closes that loophole that is left by the Hawking-Penrose discussion. And so you have these multiple lines of evidence and developments within theoretical physics, all affirming a beginning to the physical universe, the universe of matter, space, time, and energy. And that's a very significant philosophical, that scientific result has very significant philosophical implications, because whereas if you have a materialistic or naturalistic worldview, that worldview affirms the eternality of matter, that matter and energy are eternal and self-existent and do not therefore need an external creator. But if the universe itself came into existence a finite time ago, it raises a question of causal origins, and it requires a cause which transcends the physical domains of matter, space, time, and energy. And then for that and other reasons, I think has a kind of the causal profile of the entity which would be sufficient to produce the universe is one that starts to look an awful lot like a transcendent creator, the creator of theism. And so that's the way I read the situation. There are newer cosmological models that have been proposed. There was a oscillating universe model in the 80s that kind of went by the boards, as there were both thermodynamic and observational considerations that counted against it. Sir Roger Penrose has formulated a newer version of, it's a kind of oscillating universe model. It's called the cyclical conformal cosmology. I write about it in the epilogue to the second edition of my book, the paperback edition, and show that it's if true, it has huge unexplained fine-tuning problems that it raises, and so it's kind of a out of the frying pan into the fire type of thing. But it's also a highly speculative model for which there's no direct evidence. It's yet another attempt to circumvent the obvious conclusion of the experiment or the observational evidence that we have. So I think there's a pretty strong set of indicators that the universe has a beginning. And if you want to get around that, probably the best way to do that is to invoke something like quantum cosmology. But that actually didn't get around the beginning in the end. And it also portrayed the universe as arising from pure math, which is very weird. How do you get matter out of math? When you think about that, you realize that math is conceptual and the concepts exist in minds. Even some of the proponents of quantum cosmology, such as the physicist Alexander Vilenkin, have said, well, are we then, if we're invoking these prior mathematical laws as the explanation for the origin of the universe, are we really saying, therefore, that the universe came from a mind? So I think the materialists are in a box. I think there's different ways to try to get around it, but the newer cosmological models invoke prior unexplained fine-tuning, which suggests a mind. Those that are trying to get around the finite nature of the universe, the attempt to get around the evidence for a beginning with quantum cosmology, I think failed on its own terms and had its own theistic implications if true. And so I lay all this out in the book, as there's kind of a cosmological trilemma. If you're a naturalist, you got to pick your poison, and there really isn't a good naturalistic explanation for the origin of the universe.
And so, just in a nutshell, what is that trilemma that you? Because everything that you just said, I loved, and I'm going to have to play that back. And
sorry, yeah, it's too long of an answer. I'm sorry.
No, it's great though. So yeah, what
you accept this, either the standard Big Bang model or the inflationary cosmological model, and conjoin it with straight up general relativity, which is our best theory of gravity. It implies a cosmological singularity based on the general relativistic considerations that led to the singularity theorems, but the observational evidence is all pointing to the same thing, to a beginning, to the expansion, a point past which you cannot back extrapolate. So you have this,
right.
So this beginning point.
Yeah.
So if you say, well, maybe, but general relativity we can only back extrapolate so far based on general relativity. Once you get within what's called Planck time, which is 10 to the minus 43rd of a second. I mean, to say it's a blink of an eye is a gross exaggeration. I mean, you in that tiny little bit of smidgen of space and tiny little increment of time, the idea is that quantum effects may have predominated. So we can't be sure that gravity would have worked exactly the same way in that narrow window just after the beginning. And so we can't be sure of back extrapolating all the way to the beginning based on general relativity. Therefore, the Hawking, Penrose, Ellis proofs of a singularity can be taken as, they're pointing to a beginning, but they can't conclusively prove it. And so then Hawking himself, who didn't like the implications of his own proof, spent a lot of time developing quantum cosmological models, or a model. And so that was sort of the go-to refutation of the cosmological argument for the existence of God. But, not an absolute beginning, but you have this idea that maybe there's some mathematically describable state or mathematical reality that preexists the expansion of the universe. And this was called the idea is that there's a universal wave function that's analogous to what's going on with the wave function in regular quantum mechanics, where the wave function is describing all the possible universes that could exist, one of which would be ours. And if ours is one of those possible universes, then the math of quantum mechanics is said to explain the origin of our universe. But the weird thing is, there's this thing prior to the expansion of the universe is not a material state. It's a mathematical description of possible states. And so how you get from a mathematical description or quantum physical laws that apply to the early universe, quantum physical gravity laws, to an actual physical state is not ever really explained by quantum cosmologists. And instead you have this weird situation where you get, if you're just looking at this in a very clear-eyed way from the standpoint of metaphysics as to what's being claimed about what is real, well, you got math and then you have matter. Well, how does the math create the matter when math is inherently conceptual? And there's even another wrinkle on that, in that the math has to be highly constrained to get the outcome you want. And the people doing the constraining of possibilities are the theoretical mathematicians saying, we want this set of constraints on the there's a big prior equation called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation that has an infinite number of solutions. And to get a universal wave function that might describe a universe like ours, the mathematicians have to impose boundary constraints on that big hairy equation to get the outcome they want that would include a universe like ours. So they're actually having to input information into the mathematical apparatus to model the origin of the universe. Well, inputs of information are in their simulation coming from their own minds. And so what I think is being simulated is actually the need for an act of God to create the universe. It's very weirdly theistic. It leads to very weirdly theistic implications if you take the quantum cosmological model seriously.
That's interesting.
Probably also a lot to be talking about in a Zoom call, but
no, this is good though.
In Return of the God hypothesis, I lay it out very, very clearly. The third option is to go with one of these newer cosmological models. There's one by Paul Steinhardt, and then there's the cyclical conformal cosmology model of Penrose. It's not clear to me that Penrose's model gets rid of a beginning, but even if it does, he's got both of these newer models have prior unexplained fine-tuning problems. They really make the fine-tuning really, really more acute. So it's and fine-tuning, I think, points to a fine-tuner, and we can talk about that more. So I think there's the cosmological landscape is not favorable to a materialistic worldview or metaphysics. The materialistic explanations, I think, are not adequate to explain the origin of the universe. And yet theism provides exactly the sort of entity that would be required to explain the origin of matter, space, time, and energy from nothing physical. And that is a transcendent, immaterial creator of great power and intelligence.
So I was on a debate panel recently with, it was me and then it was 5 atheists that I was having to kind of go against, if you will. And
Sounds fun.
it was a good time. It was actually it was on a Zoom call like this one. So there was that.
You're a little outnumbered.
Yeah, I was a little outnumbered, but I want to run this by you because I'm a layperson. I'm not, I don't, so, but I'm so appreciating everything that you're saying. So I want to run this by you and see, I'm going to try to kind of distill down some of what you said for the audience in a more, I guess, layman's terms. And then also kind of say, like, this is essentially the argument that I was trying to make in this panel discussion. I want you to speak into it and say, is this right? Is this wrong? Et cetera. So I was contending that given that we have reality or existence, something must be eternal. And then it's the question of what is a more plausible eternal thing? Is it some form of energy or matter, or is it something outside of energy and matter? And I think what you're saying is that we have a tremendous amount of scientific evidence pointing to the fact that energy and matter had a beginning, which leads all the more so to the conclusion that whatever is that eternal thing that
Is
wasn't
not the matter and energy.
is not the matter and energy. So I was saying that an eternal God as sort of your X plus whatever equals everything. There has to be that X at the beginning of the equation that is the uncaused eternal thing. So help me. Yeah.
Yeah. I think your way of framing it is beautiful, because people will say, well, then who created the creator? If you posit a transcendent intelligence as the source of the universe. And you can say, of course, the exact same thing. Richard Dawkins wants to say that life emerged from a self-replicating molecule. Well, what where did the replicator come from? And here's the point: every system of thought has to posit something as a primitive, as the thing from which everything else came, because one of the great axioms of logic is that from nothing comes. Nothing comes from nothing. Nothing ever could. I think it was in The Sound of Music, so it must be true, right?
Right.
But no, I mean, this is so. In people, logically, if there was a genuine nothing, you're not going to get anything from that. So there had to be a something that was the thing from which everything else came. And the options that have been presented are the options of the great worldviews. Materialism says it was matter and energy. Pantheism says it was an impersonal God. Mm-hmm. Deism said it was a God who acted at the beginning, but has had nothing to do with the universe since. Theism said it was a personal God who acted at the beginning and who has continued to be involved with the creation that he made. So you have, those are four great worldviews. Which of them is true? Which one best fits the evidence? That is the subject of my latest book, Return of the God Hypothesis. Mm-hmm. And I make the same argument you do, that everything has to be, every system of thought has to posit something as the thing from which everything else came, mm-hmm. the eternal self-existent thing. And materialism, I think, which was assumed to be the best answer coming into the early 20th century, has been shown by successive scientific discoveries to not provide the best explanation, to not invoke an entity which is a plausible primitive, the thing from which everything else came, because matter and energy, as best we can tell, had a beginning. They are contingent things upon something else, some other type of cause, which transcends the domains of matter, space, time, and energy.
That's beautiful. Okay, so I'm not crazy. Good. That's great.
And conversely, if you posit the existence of a transcendent, beyond space-time entity who is personal and intelligent and powerful, then you can provide an adequate explanation for what we see. And there's a mode of reasoning used in science and philosophy. It was used by Darwin. It's called inference to the best explanation, where mm-hmm. you posit that entity, which, if true, would best explain the evidence. And so I like to make the cosmological argument as an inference to the best explanation, not trying to prove definitively that the cause must have these particular attributes, but rather positing the type of cause with a set of attributes which would be sufficient to explain what we see. And it turns out that when you do that, when you engage in that intellectual exercise, the type of attributes that the cause must possess to provide an adequate explanation are precisely the attributes that, say, Jews and Christians have long ascribed to a theistic God, a God who transcends the universe, who is separate from it, but who is also active in it.
I want to transition into fine tuning, but I have to say something on that point really quick. You brought up the Rosetta Stone, and I have often thought about describing God as a type of Rosetta Stone that once you can see his explanatory power for not only the creation of the universe, but also the existence of human rights, the reality of beauty, the intelligibility of the universe itself, et cetera, et cetera. You can go through
beautifully stated, right? Our ability to know. This was the argument that convinced me of theism, was the argument from epistemological necessity. And in a conversation with Thomas Nagel one time over lunch, he asked me how I had become a theist and a Christian. I started to explain the argument to him, and the argument, the idea that theism uniquely underwrites our confidence in the reliability of the human mind and therefore our ability to know the world. And as I got halfway into it, he said, no, you don't need to explain this to me. He said, there's no question, said the great atheist philosopher, he said, there's no question that theism solves a lot of philosophical problems. And the philosophical problem that's been with us since the late Enlightenment has been the problem of knowledge. And it wasn't a problem during the period of the scientific revolution, because the early scientists were almost to a person devout Christians, and they believed in the intelligibility of nature because they believed in the reliability of the mind, given that our minds had been created in the image of God, who had also created the rational order of the universe. So there was in their view, a principle of correspondence, that the rationality that we have built into our minds is of such a kind that we can understand the rationality built into nature, the rationality in design and order. This is a point that the great Cambridge physicist Sir John Polkinghorne liked to make. He talked about the reason within matching the reason without out in the world. So the big crisis in philosophy, the whole postmodernist turn and all of that, is really a crisis of knowledge. And theism is I think the one thing that resolves that nicely, and so many other things. It gives us an account of the existence of objective moral principles. What do we mean when we say ought? We mean something more than saying is. Well, what's implied by that ought statement? It implies it's the standard above us all to which we can appeal. Well, where does that standard come from? Theism gives a good account of that. I don't think materialism or evolutionary theory does. So you just go down the line, and I think theism has an unrivaled explanatory power, not just with respect to the things that I've written about in this last book about the scientific evidences for biological and cosmological origins, but also some of these deep philosophical questions about the nature and origin of morality, the nature and our ability to know the world, the problem in epistemology, questions of meaning. So it is a kind of people have a hard time believing in God because they can't see him.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't see quarks or DNA molecules either. We infer their existence based on other things we can see. And we infer to those other things because of their explanatory power. And I think that when we understand that that's how we reason about things in science as well as in philosophy, then suddenly theism should rise in our estimation because of its extraordinary explanatory power.
I still want to get to fine tuning, but I'm loving the trail that we're on. So I want to.
We can pivot to fine tuning anytime you want.
Okay. No, but this is so good, because what you just described about how, and I've actually thought about this even on a more basic level too, where we have an appetite for food, we desire food, and voila, food exists. We eat it, and it actually nourishes our bodies, and we are able to live. And I know that sounds so silly, but that in and of itself is an interesting thing, that the planet has resources that actually cause us to. And so on that point, and also on the point of what you were talking about, of our mind is able to apply itself to the material world and arrive at conclusions that actually are true, and then which is what you were just talking about, and then also on the moral point, that we have moral intuitions that actually are universally agreed upon in the world at large. Now, it's interesting because I get in the comments sections of my videos, I get people plugging in as a solution for all of those things, basically a version of evolution. It's just the idea that all of those things are explained by the fact that we have the privilege of, at this point in time, things have evolved such that we experience that connection between our internal desire and our external world, because we're the fittest who have survived, and so we get that privilege or benefit. And I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I have always felt like that doesn't fully explain those realities, but I also can kind of see where they're coming from. I don't know if you have a thought about that.
I have many thoughts about that. I mean, in the first place, I think the use of evolutionary theory to explain the origin of religious belief or criminal behavior or altruism or our moral sensibilities, to me, is now laughably facile. It's extremely superficial form of thinking. We're having trouble using mutation and selection and other similar standard evolutionary mechanisms to explain the origin of protein folds, to explain the origin of body plans. The main thing evolutionary theory was designed to explain was the origin of new biological form. 2004 book with MIT Press lists a whole category, Stuart Newman and Gerd Muller, and they have a table in their introduction to the book, and they list all the unsolved problems of modern evolutionary theory. One of them is the origin of biological form, the very thing that Darwin was supposed to have explained. Let me just, I made both these arguments on the Rogan podcast, but let me make them again. Mm-hmm. Okay. The mutation selection mechanism, well, let's start here. If you want to build a new organism, we now know you have to have new information. It's just like in our computer world. If you want to give your computer a new function, you have to provide new code. So if you want to build a new animal form with new anatomical structures and therefore new types of cells, then you're going to need new proteins to service the cells, the new cell types. And so at the very least, you're going to need a lot of new genetic information to build those new proteins. So where does that information come from? Well, the standard Darwinian explanation is that new variation, biological variation, making new form possible, arises as the result of randomly arising mutations that are then, if successful, preserved and passed on by natural selection. But since the 1960s, we've become really since 58 in Crick's sequence hypothesis, but that took a while to confirm. Since the 60s, as it became clear that mutations were operating, if they were operating on the sequence of characters, the nucleotide basis in the DNA. Crick's sequence hypothesis was that DNA contains digital code that is the nucleotide basis, the subunits along the DNA spine are functioning like alphabetic characters or digital characters in a section of machine code. They're providing instructions for building proteins. So since that realization has arisen, we realize then that what mutations would be doing would be changing those arrangements of A's, G's, and T's, the digital characters in the quaternary genetic code. Now, we have analogous experience of those of that type of information carrying system, and that is in our computer world. We have digital software. Bill Gates' DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever devised. Richard Dawkins has acknowledged that DNA is like a machine code. Leroy Hood says DNA contains digital code. So what happens when we randomly change a digital bit string in a section of functioning computer code? If we randomly change the zeros and ones, what happens? Well, two possibilities. Well, here's the question. Do we degrade the function of the code before we ever get to a new stretch of functional code? Or is it possible to gradually, by random means, change one section of software and develop a new, say, program or operating system? If I ask that question hypothetically to a group of software designers, they all laugh. It's obvious what happens, that those changes will degrade the existing function long before you'll come up with some fundamentally new function that a new stretch of code would be required to produce. Turns out the same thing is true in the biological realm, that the sections of the arrangements of A's, G's, and T's that will code for functional proteins are extremely rare among all the possible ways of arranging those characters. Exponentially rare. For one short protein, a colleague of mine, Douglas Axe, who worked on this problem at Cambridge for 14 years, determined that the ratio was 1 over 10 to the 77th power. For every string that will provide a stable, function-ready, function-capable structure called a protein fold, there are 10 to the 77th ways of arranging those same characters that will not produce such a thing, that will give you gibberish. So what that means is then, as you start to change the digital characters, the A's, G's, and T's, you are overwhelmingly more likely to fall into a functionless abyss than to maintain function. And as other scientists have done experiments, they're called site-directed mutagenesis experiments, they found that this is absolutely true. There's a scientist in Israel named Dan Tawfik, who died fairly recently, very tragically, but did some very important work on this same question. And he started randomly changing the characters in the DNA to see what type of effect it would have on stable protein folds. Could he generate a new protein fold from a pre-existing protein fold? And he found that within a very small number of mutations in his experiments between 3 and 15, the stability of the protein fold was lost. The thermodynamic stability was lost. It would no longer fold into a stable structure. Therefore, it's no longer possible to perform a function. So he said that the protein folds, which are the fundamental unit of biological innovation, are ice. Are you still hearing me with the mic?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Yeah, they are isolated from one another in almost like galaxies separated from one another. So whereas we can get modifications of function and even some new function arising within the structure of a stable fold, getting from one fold to another is effectively biologically, it's extremely implausible. We have no Darwinian account of how that happens. Now, in response to this argument that I made on Joe Rogan, we had a young postdoc at University of Cambridge, whom I happen to know, challenged me by saying, well, no, in the COVID proteins, one of the proteins that's involved in the COVID virus, there's a protein that has accumulated 37 or 33, I can't remember, mutations. And he said, aha, Meyer said it was between 3 and 15, but that misunderstands the argument, because the argument is not about how many mutations can accumulate in a fold. It's about what will happen to the fold as mutations accumulate. And the claim is that as mutations accumulate, you will eventually drop into a non-functional abyss before you'll ever produce a new protein fold. And it happens in the proteins that Tawfik examined that the threshold was about 15. But we've never said or denied that you might accumulate more mutations, just that as you accumulate the mutations, you will inevitably lose the structural stability of the protein in question before you generate a new protein fold. And the counterexample that was offered by this young postdoc actually proved that point. The protein that was involved in COVID has 1,200 amino acids. The 30-some changes did not actually change the existing fold. It just accumulated random changes that had no effect on the fold structure. It hadn't yet degraded. But typically to get from one fold to another, you need about a 75% difference in sequence, and 35 or 37, whatever it was, divided by 1,200 is about 3%. So this was a 3% sequence change, not nearly enough to have a hope of changing a fold. And the big point was this accumulation of mutations did not change the fold structure. And that's the fundamental problem that we have gone to the mat to identify, is that the accumulation of mutations will degrade the stability of a fold long before they'll ever produce a fundamentally new fold. And there's, as long as I'm on this track, there's an additional reason for that. It has to do with the physics of fold stabilization or destabilization. As you accumulate those mutations, the fold will destabilize and lose structure, and at that point you can't get it back simply by randomly mutating.
And what is sort of like the philosophical significance of everything that you just unpacked there, just to pin that?
Well, it's the scientific significance first, and that is that neo-Darwinism, which relies on random mutations and natural selection, cannot give an account of the most fundamental unit of change in biological history. If you want to build a new animal, you have to have a new body plan. To build a new body plan is a unique arrangement of body parts and tissues, new anatomical structures and tissues. Well, if you need new tissues or anatomical structures, to build those, you need new types of cells. But new cell types require unique proteins. If you want to build a gut, for example, you've got to have digestive enzymes. But proteins are built from the information in DNA. And so to build anything in biology, at the very least, you have to have new instructions in DNA that are capable of building new types of protein folds, capable of new types of protein functions. And if you can't explain that, then you haven't really explained anything. And to extrapolate beyond the strictly biological and anatomical, to say, well, we can explain human behavior or the origin of morality, the origin of criminality, or by in Darwinian means, is, as I say, it's laughably facile. And these types of discussions on internet forums with internet atheists, they want to use evolution weakly defined. They're not even talking whether, they're not clear whether they mean change, whether they mean common ancestry, whether they mean mutation and selection, or some other proposed evolutionary mechanism. It's a very hand-wavy explanation. Now, but taking it on its own terms, let's make a riff on that for a minute as well, because the idea is that, well, okay, there's a survival value in morality, and so evolution. This is the evolutionary naturalistic explanation for the origin of morality. So the basic idea is that morality, the moral intuitions we have, are a consequence, have been programmed into us by evolution. But so has an impulse to rape, pillage, and murder. So has an impulse to steal. And so morality, at the very least, is about distinguishing good from evil, the good course of action from the bad course of action. But if the evolutionary process is responsible for the moral intuition, so-called, and the intuition to do other things that we would want to say are not moral, then the evolutionary process cannot provide an explanation for the distinction. It doesn't distinguish between it's programmed into us all kinds of instincts. Then on what evolutionary basis can we distinguish between the instincts that we want to say are good and the instincts that we want to say are bad? We can provide no such account of that distinction, because it's all based on survival of the fittest, or the propagation of the genes, or what have you. The evolutionary account does not make it possible to provide a distinction or give an account of what that distinction is. Moreover, if I know that my moral intuitions, so-called, are merely the product of an undirected, mindless process that is merely maximizing the survival of the human race, but my own interests diverge from that of the rest of the human race, I have no reason to obey that moral instinct as it's been defined by the evolutionary ethicists. So if it's in my interest to abscond with the money that I have stolen from the bank and go to an obscure South American country and hide out, well, what do I care if doing that doesn't advance the interests of the human race?
Or to be even more dramatic, eugenics, right? Eugenics are a very direct, like Hitler's sensibility that we should get rid of the
weak and the lame and the crippled.
I mean, that from an evolutionary perspective, that would actually check out as a moral
It
behavior.
was motivated by an evolutionary perspective, very decidedly so.
Right.
And continued to be, not just with the Nazis and Hitler, but we were doing it in the United States into the 1920s and 30s. It really wasn't till after the war, when it was exposed what Hitler had been doing, that practice was fully eradicated here in the United States. And
Right.
so, but and that's a very good example, because our moral intuitions would want to say, hey, it's very important to care for the weak and the disenfranchised and and people who have been crippled by disease. And but the evolutionary argument there would be, to advance the survival value of the human race, we need to eradicate those things that weaken the gene pool, which was the Hitlerian argument,
Right.
which is grotesque, but it's morally grotesque, but it was also morally predicated on the very evolutionary theory that many now claim is the basis of morality.
I found it so interesting in the debate between William Lane Craig and Sam Harris on morality. Sam Harris's entire point comes down to that he says that morality is defined as human flourishing, full stop. And it doesn't, and this is the same thing I see again and again and again, is it doesn't explain, though, why. It ends right there. Just, it is what it is.
Well, I think there is a connection between morality and human flourishing.
Of
I think morality was given to us, the moral instruction that was given to us in, for example, the Ten Commandments or the Bible, as well as through our conscience, is designed to promote human flourishing. And so that helps answer a common objection to theistic accounts of morality, the divine command theory, for example,
right,
which says that morality is only true because God says so, and therefore that it's that morality is nothing more than an arbitrary dictate of the Almighty. Well, no, that's not the theistic view, a proper theistic view of morality. It is true because God said so, but God said it so because he meant it to promote human flourishing, and that the morality that he's given us comports with the design of the human being and what is required for human flourishing. And so the moral commands of the Almighty are a reflection of his love for his creatures and his understanding of how he designed them to best function. And so it's not arbitrary, but rather motivated by love and knowledge of the system that he made.
No, that's a great point. And but the point that I'm trying to make, though, is that to simply say it is what it is not a good argument, because
it's not an explanation.
Exactly.
I mean, but underlying that, to be fair to Harris, he's trying to give an evolutionary account of things, and he says that evolution is maximizing human flourishing.
Right.
Well, yes and no. It also it maximizes the survival of certain organisms, but often at the expense of others. And so if I have an instinct of violence, that may mean that I get to propagate more of my genes than the person that I've killed. But we wouldn't want to say that my killing that other person was a moral act, or murdering for sure was not a moral act. So again, I don't think evolutionary ethics can give an account of what we actually mean by morality. It fails to account for the distinction between two different sets of acts, both of which would be ultimately explicable in evolutionary terms. And if they're both explicable in evolutionary terms, it's not the difference that makes a difference in accounting for the difference between good and evil.
My memory card only has about 10 minutes left, which is a real shame, because I do want to get into.
So we got to talk about fine tuning, right?
We got to go to fine tuning.
We didn't get to fine tuning.
To close the loop.
Divergence.
Yep.
The problem you're having is that I'm also I taught philosophy for a long time, so I love these other questions as well as the stuff I've most recently written about.
So without any further ados, let's get into fine tuning. And I want to, I guess, by way of intro for this part of our conversation, very often I hear people talk about the idea of, we've won the cosmic lottery, and so we have the vantage point that everything is working in our favor, and that fine tuning is is the certain thing. Or another analogy people say is, the hole in the ground that the water falls into. They say, wow, this hole is shaped perfectly to fit the water, or some, there's different versions of this idea.
Yes, I know all these arguments. This is,
Yes.
Again, I think they're quite facile. Well, let's do the first one, which is the multiverse, okay? Because that's the go-to explanation now.
Yep.
Do you want me to reprise briefly what fine tuning is all about, or
yes? Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So engineers have a concept called tolerances, and that's the idea that if you want to get achieve a function, then there are various parts that might go into a machine or a circuit or a system that have to fall within narrow ranges, outside of which the function would be impossible. A simple example would be a nut and a bolt, and there's a tolerance. The bolt can't be any larger than X or any smaller than Y and still thread into that nut. Okay, so it's designed to fit within very narrow tolerances. What the physicists have discovered is that the fundamental parameters of the universe, the strength of the fundamental forces, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces, the force that is driving the expansion of the universe called the cosmological constant, the masses of elementary particles, the mass of the quark, for example, the speed of light, the many different fundamental parameters are just right. They fall within very narrow ranges or tolerances, outside of which life as we know it, and even stable galaxies and basic chemistry would be impossible. Couldn't get elements heavier than helium, for example, without a number of fine-tuning parameters falling in those sweet spots. So what do we make of that? Well, this idea of fine-tuning, in our experience, we also know of other systems that are finely tuned, French recipes, for example, or the parts in an internal combustion engine. We were talking about that earlier, or the circuitry, the arrangement of electrical components on a circuit board, or the digital code in the relation to the hardware in a computer system. All these things rely on numerous elements falling within narrow tolerances of one kind or another. So these are finely tuned systems. Well, what do all these systems have in common? If we see, by fine tuning, we mean an ensemble of improbable parameters that work together jointly to accomplish some remarkable object or end or outcome, some function. All of those systems that I just mentioned have one thing in common, and that is that they were designed by intelligent agents. So when Sir Fred Hoyle, long-time, hard-bitten, scientific atheist who rejected the Big Bang because he thought it smacked too much of the book of Genesis, discovers a whole cascade of fine-tuning parameters that are necessary to account for the abundance of carbon in the universe. Hoyle ends up having a philosophical about face, takes an about face, and he ends up saying that the best data we have about the fine-tuning suggests that a super intellect monkeyed with physics in order to make life possible. And so he adopts a kind of rudimentary theism after having been a long-standing scientific atheist upon the discovery of the fine-tuning. He says it's a common sense interpretation. Why is it common sense? Well, because in our experience, finely tuned systems that we would describe and define as finely tuned, invariably arise from the activity of intelligent agents. So that's the anthropic fine-tuning argument in a nutshell. Now, the counter argument to that, the main one, has been this idea of a multiverse, that, well, yes, we live, as you were saying, in a very improbable universe, that getting all these parameters just in the just right sweet spot in the Goldilocks zone is incredibly improbable. But it happens that there are gabillions and gabillions and gabillions of other universes out there, and we just happen to be in the lucky one where all the parameters fell in the sweet spot, And because there are so many universes, that some universe somewhere would inevitably have to acquire the right set of conditions to allow for life. And we just happen to be in that lucky universe. So rather than our existence being the product of design because of all the parameters that would have had to be just right to produce us, instead we can say that what we're experiencing is an observer selection effect. That we as observers look at the fine tuning. We're in awe because it's so improbable, but it's just a selection effect because we're in that lucky universe and don't know it. So that's the multiverse counter argument. So I can also then give you my counter argument, but I'm making an awfully if you want to hear it.
That is what I want to hear, because I think. And well, let me say one thing really quick. Maybe include this or I don't know, maybe even rebut this in case my thinking is off here. But I want to highlight that within what you just said of the multiverse theory, it seems to me that there is also a level of faith being applied towards that belief. And I don't know if you know what I mean by that, but we're talking about things that we can't actually observe. We're talking about the philosophical possibility of there being an infinite amount of other universes. We're not actually able to use science to arrive at that particular conclusion. And so is there a level of faith being applied toward the multiverse similar to the other possibility of an intelligent designer or not? I don't know, but maybe just weave that in.
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about that. As a philosopher of science, I'm kind of loath to say it's faith versus science in any realm. Okay, I'd rather talk about what we know, what we have evidence, and we have inference or interpretation of the evidence. And so I don't fault the multiverse hypothesis for invoking an unobservable. How could I? As someone arguing for the past action of a designing intelligence, am invoking an unobservable action as well. I would say that science, not just metaphysics or philosophy or religion, routinely invokes unobservable entities, subsurface geological faults, subatomic particles, the structure of the DNA molecule. All of these things are not directly observable to us, but rather we affirm their existence because of those things that can be, those observables that can be explained if we posit the existence of these unobservable entities. And that science itself depends upon methods that often involve this type of indirect inference to unobservable entities to provide theoretical framework for explaining observables. Science is indirectly inferential. We move from what can be seen to what cannot be seen. So many scientists have, therefore many physicists have told me that they understanding this, take the debate about whether a theistic design or the multiverse provides a better explanation of the fine tuning as a kind of a wash, that both theories are equally plausible and both have an element of faith, if you will, in that they're affirming an unobservable. But that type of faith is common throughout science. That's a point I would like to make. Just it's a bee in my bonnet, sorry. But I do think, as does William Lane Craig and a number of physicists, Luke Barnes, that the fine-tuning, the theistic design argument provides a better explanation of the fine-tuning than does the multiverse. There are reasons, objective reasons, to prefer it, the theistic design argument over the multiverse. One that's fairly obvious is that in science, we typically want to affirm the Occam's razor principle, that all other things being equal, we would prefer simpler explanations where simpler is defined as not multiplying theoretical entities unnecessarily. So to explain the fine-tuning, the theist has to invoke the singular concept of a transcendent intelligence. The multiverse advocate has to not only invoke all these other universes, but as I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, but not one, but two different universe generating mechanisms that require in turn the affirmation of multiple theoretical entities. The existence of strings, the existence of multi-dimensions of space, the existence of something called an inflaton field, and on and on. I enumerate the number of theoretical entities that have to be posited on the multiverse explanation versus the theistic one. And it's about 10-to-1 ratio, something like that.
And can I say really, really quick, also not getting around the more basic problem of anything at all as opposed to nothing. Only removing that problem, right? And my understanding is multiverse. Okay,
I would bracket that problem as something that's the issue of the cosmological argument, or that's the issue. Yeah, I mean that is a huge problem for naturalism, no question. Why is there something rather than nothing? But
I guess what I'm saying is that the multiverse theory doesn't explain how did the first of the infinite multiverses come from, or it doesn't really, unless I'm misunderstanding it. It seems like it's only removing that problem by one more step.
Yeah, let me give you my second critique of the multiverse, and it'll connect to your concern. Okay. And that is that there's a problem with the multiverse as an explanation, as a causal explanation for the fine tuning. And that is that even if you have this gabillion other universes out there, if they are causally disconnected from our universe, and what we mean by a universe is a closed causally connected system. So if you've got other universes and they're not causally connected to our system, then whatever happens in those other universes has no effect on anything taking place in this universe, including whatever it was that took place that was responsible for fixing the precise values of the fine-tuning parameters. So in virtue of that, in order to actually provide a causal explanation of the fine-tuning in this universe, the fine-tuning advocate must posit some kind of universe-generating mechanism that can function as a common cause of all the universes, ours included, so that all the universe, or so that our universe can be portrayed as a kind of lucky winner in a giant cosmic lottery. And the current multiverse hypotheses do posit such universe-generating mechanism. One based on string theory, and the other based on what's called inflationary cosmology. And that's where you get all these additional theoretical entities that have to be posited to render the multiverse hypothesis plausible at all. But in addition, it turns out that both the multiverse hypothesis and the string theoretic, the multiverse hypothesis, that both of the universe generating mechanisms, the inflationary cosmological model, which invokes something called an inflaton field, and the string theoretic landscape themselves require prior, exquisite, unexplained fine-tuning to render their ability to generate additional universes plausible, even in theory. And so to explain the fine-tuning, the multiverse advocate has to posit two different universe-generating mechanisms, which gives you a profligate ontology, all kinds of theoretical entities you have to posit to make that plausible. But then those theoretical entities themselves require prior fine-tuning that's unexplained. And so you're right back to where you started, which is unexplained fine-tuning. But we do know of one cause that can produce fine-tuning in our experience. And again, that is intelligence. Think about the French recipes and the internal combustion engines and your radio dial and whatever. Fine-tuning is, in our experience, a product of mind. So the common sense interpretation is the best interpretation or explanation because it's simpler in the Occam sense, and it does not beg the question as to the ultimate origin of fine-tuning.
You know, one thing that I think would be good to kind of pivot into here is some of the origin of life stuff. And I think that one thing that's very interesting within this topic that I want to just, by way of intro, kind of state is that, and Rogan did bring this up also, is the idea of we have limited knowledge. And so anything, and actually when I was talking to James Tour, this was the main criticism that came up there as well, right? Is that we can't make, no scientist has been able to go from non-life to life in the lab ever, right? But the criticism of that is, well, just given enough time. And I've been using this phrase like time of the gaps as a alternative to God of the gaps, which is sort of on the other side of the aisle, you see people saying, yeah, but just with enough time, just wait for it. Just in the future, everything is going to play out according to our vantage point. And I don't know. I just wanted to state that by way of intro.
The claim is that anytime you make a positive argument for the activity of a designing intelligence, or every time you make a positive argument for theism, that you're committing an argument from ignorance, because we might later find out that there is some materialistic process that can produce the effect in question, which you claim is solely explained by a designing intelligence. My reply to that objection is to point out that the argument for intelligent design is not based on a gap in our knowledge. It's based on our uniform and repeated experience. It's based on everything we know about what it takes to, for example, build or generate digital information. Again, going back to the discussion earlier in the interview about Watson and Crick and the sequence hypothesis, during the late 1950s and 60s, we learned that DNA contains information in a digital form for building protein structures. And everything we know about the origin of information, especially when we find it in a digital alphabetic form, suggests that a mind played a role. I mentioned that Bill Gates has noted that DNA is like a software program. Richard Dawkins has said the same. It's like machine code. Well, what we know about machine code and software is that it always comes from a mind, not an undirected material process. And in fact, whenever you see information and you trace it back to its source, whether you're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription on the Rosetta Stone, or information embedded in a radio signal, or information in a set of instructions, or in a newspaper headline, or in a digital environment, that information is always issues from an intelligent source. So our inference to the intelligent design of life based on the presence of information is not based on an absence of knowledge. It's based on everything we know about how nature works. And there's these origin of life experiments that people have performed. In other words, it's not based on ignorance. It's based on our knowledge of the cause and effect structure of the world. What we know from our uniform and repeated experience is that it takes a mind to generate large amounts of specified information, especially in a digital form. Mm-hmm. Now, the materialist wants to say, well, but we don't know the future. We don't know that maybe someday we'll find a materialistic explanation for saying, well, maybe you will. But I explain in the book, Signature in the Cell, which is the one behind me there. That's my first book. That the different approaches to explaining the origin of information materialistically have not only empirical problems, but there are grave theoretical problems associated with them. Some people say, well, we're going to find a law that will generate information. But laws, by definition, describe highly redundant, orderly patterns that are, by definition, lacking the complexity of an informational sequence. So this is a contradiction in terms to say that law will generate information. Law describes redundant order, where order is different than information, and categorically different. So I say good luck to the materialists. They can go and keep looking for a naturalistic explanation for the origin of information. But everything we know now suggests that you need a mind. And so the best explanation, albeit provisional, as all scientific inferences are, is the best explanation is that that the information present in DNA is the result of a designing intelligence. That's not an argument from ignorance. It's an argument based on everything we know about the nature of DNA, the nature of life, and the cause and effect structure of the world.
What I like about your work is that I truly believe that people, and I think that history bears this out, do naturally believe in God, some version of God. I think that is, I would say from my perspective, wired into our hearts, that we have eternity in our hearts. But I think a lot of people have had this conversation framed in terms of being rational or being faith-based, believing in science and being, reasonable and thoughtful in that way, or being one of those crazy, religious people. And what I really like about your work is that I think for a lot of people, because you're able to explain things in a very built out and scientific way, I think that it helps to kind of close that gap and help people to see the reasonability of believing in God while not doing any disservice to rationality or to science. And I think that that's really important, particularly again in this sort of post Enlightenment Western and now even post truth culture that we're in, where it's just interesting because people, if you say, hey, I have a Ouija board, you want to play around with it, people will go, oh yeah, sure. There's an openness to the esoteric, to the spiritual. But if I say, hey, I have a Bible, you want to read it or do you want to pray with me? Whoa, let's not get into all that. And so it's interesting that I think a lot of what is being contended with is sort of the baggage of, and I heard you talk about sort of the meme or cartoonish version of yourself that people are often arguing against, that it's this sort of Scopes trial era version of a creationist. And I just think it's interesting because I think a lot of what we have to deal with is the baggage of some previous time period where it was reason versus faith, as if those are two different things. And so anyway, I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
It's a very nice compliment, and it's you're reading me exactly right. I, for years as a college professor, taught a course called Reasons for Faith. The two are not inimical. Science and faith are not in conflict. They're not at war. This is a late 19th century revisionist historical trope that was mainly a byproduct of the immediate aftermath of the controversy over Darwinism. The history of science has shown not only a deep compatibility between science and faith, but that religious belief, particularly Judeo-Christian religious ideas, had a huge influence on the rise of modern science in the first place. And I think what I've been arguing for in my new book, what many of my colleagues are arguing for, is that we have very good reasons to return to that framework for understanding the relationship between science and faith. That science, it provides support for theistic belief. It doesn't undermine it, nor do you have to keep your theistic beliefs in a compartment that's hermetically sealed from any scientific discoveries, lest it be challenged or something. I think that, there's a wonderful quote from Richard Dawkins where he says that the universe we observe has exactly the properties we should expect. If at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And I love the quotation because of the way it frames the issue. He's saying that the evidence we have of the world around us, when we look and we see the properties of the universe, is what we'd expect if materialism, undirected material processes, blind, pitiless processes were at work. But I, in my new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, say, well, great way to frame it, because that suggests that we can test our metaphysical hypotheses against the observations of the natural world every bit as much as we can test our scientific hypotheses. But is it really the case that what we have seen is what we would expect based on materialism? Did the materialists expect that we would have evidence of a finite universe where matter and energy come into existence a finite time ago? No, I don't think so. That's contrary to the materialist premise of the eternality of matter and energy. That they're eternal and self-existent. Did the materialists expect the exquisite fine-tuning of the universe? Did they expect the digital code or information processing system we found in cells? Richard Dawkins himself acknowledged 2 summers ago, when he saw an animation of the DNA replication system that was produced by, I think, a group of Australian animators, he said he was knocked sideways with wonder at the complexity of the digital information processing that was going on inside cells. This is not expected on the basis of blind, pitiless indifference. We don't know of any blind, undirected processes that produce not just digital code, but complex information processing systems. We know of one cause that does that, and that is the designing mind of computer software engineers. So what you'd expect on the design hypothesis is something like digital code or fine-tuning. A theist generally would expect the universe to have a beginning, that it would be a contingent feature, a contingent system based on the creative power of something else. And so time and time again, what we're finding in the natural world comports with the expectations of theists or people who believe in a prior mind of some kind, and is exactly contrary to what you'd expect based on the blind, pitiless, materialistic processes that Dawkins invokes as the basis of his worldview.
Can I say, by way of closing, that here's my bias: is I don't just want people to believe in the abstract, intelligent source of the universe. I ultimately want people. To me, this entire conversation that we've been having is dealing with the roadblocks en route to why I love these conversations, which is I want people to see that the creative God of the universe is also good and is also the hero of the story, and he's also actually manifested himself and entered our story in the person of Christ and died for our sins and defeated death and risen again. And because of that, we have hope of eternal life, and there's also meaning, and that each and every individual human being that exists for a reason. No one is an accident. Everyone exists for a reason, and everyone who exists is loved by this creator. Now, I can do that because I'm not the scientist, and so I can go off on my religious rant there. But I just want to say that, to me, we can't, in my opinion, it's silly to just stop at, oh, that's interesting. So there's an insane amount of information and complexity in the universe, and there's signature in the cell. And so there's a mind behind the universe. Okay, where do we go from here? And I just want to say, like, no.
The next most logical question is, who is that mind, and what is
right.
our and what does he want of us, if anything? I'm in an interesting role. I'm an advocate for the theory of intelligent design in my scientific and philosophical work. I help coordinate a program of scientists all over the world who are investigating evidence of design in nature, in life, in biology, in cosmology, in physics. And I have colleagues who have very different religious points of view. I have colleagues who are non-religious theists. I have some who are agnostic, who see evidence of design and don't quite know to whom they should attribute the design. I have some that are religious, that are religiously Jewish. I have some that are religiously Christian. We have a lot of interest coming from, especially the moderate Muslim world, a lot of Turkish interest in intelligent design, Egyptian interest in intelligent design. So I have in a professional capacity, I represent people. I'm articulating an argument that has support across different flavors of religious expression. I also happen to be a Christian and share your beliefs about those things. And then the Joe Rogan experience, which was a great experience, Joe is, famously probative, and he wanted to know what made me personally tick. And the one thing I didn't want to do is be evasive on a program like that. He's a respectful guy who wants to get to the bottom of issues. So he pressed me on my own personal views about religious faith. And so I shared those views. And I think there is, and then speaking personally, not as the director of a program that's advancing intelligent design in a broadly ecumenical sense, but just as a person, I think there are good answers to the questions that go beyond the questions about, well, who is the designing intelligence behind the universe, and which God are we talking? If it's God, which I've argued for in my latest book, which God are we talking about, and how could we know that, and what kinds of historical evidence? I don't think science can answer all those questions about which form of religious belief makes most sense, but I do think there are ways of answering those questions. Many of them are actually evidential, as well as just a matter of evaluating revelation. I think there's, for example, lots of evidence for the reliability of the biblical narrative. And I think that means that you have to then take those claims seriously. So I got into a lot of that in the Rogan interview, wondered if maybe I shouldn't have, but oddly, I got more affirmation from talking in that personal way from some of my Jewish colleagues than anyone else. So I think, we all have a right to engage in this deep discussion. These are the deep and important questions, and we've kind of sidelined them in our culture for a while. We've been also much focused on politics that we haven't been thinking as much about the deeper underlying issues. And so I've always regarded anyone who loves these questions from whatever point of view they hold as kind of a friend by default. I have
Hmm.
people that I do debates with who are strict naturalists or materialists, but I think that the very fact that they're interested in these fundamental worldview questions means that there's a kind of kindred spirit at work in the conversation. And so anyway, I agree with you. I'm a Christian. I would like everyone to see and understand and know the person of Jesus Christ. I think he's incredibly compelling. But I also understand that it takes time. Everybody's in process, and it takes time to get there. So I applaud what you're doing, and thank you for giving me a chance to share some of the stuff about my work.
Last question, I promise. We were about to land the plane, but I got to know now that you mentioned that aspect of you being on Joe Rogan, was there any part of the conversation that you wish you could have redone? You mentioned how he's very probative. Was there anything that you wish you had said differently, or that you had gone into more so, or anything like that? Because I thought you did a fantastic job, but I just always know, for me, when I do something live like that, it's the
Yeah, there's one thing I had a friend from England pointed out. Um, he asked me, "Do you think that human beings are the pinnacle of creation?"
right.
And I think I should have just said yes. I
Hmm.
don't think there's anything disreputable about that. What I did instead is I went full-born philosopher on him and started explaining things about human beings that are unique: our ability to use
The
language, our
language,
ability
yeah,
to use math, our sense of humor, our ability to design complex structures and use. And we got into a whole discussion about the origin of language,
right.
which was
Which was
fun.
good. It was great.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was
yeah.
great.
But I think there's, I should have just said yes, because I don't think there's anything disreputable about that viewpoint. I think that there is a teleos, a purpose, an end to the to nature. That God made many things with us in mind. He made the universe with us in mind. This is the whole idea of the
Right,
anthropic principle, or not that, well, there's different versions of the anthropic principle, but the idea of anthropic fine tuning is that the universe was fine tuned with anthropos, with us in mind.
right.
And I think I hold that for biblical reasons. I think that's what the Bible teaches, but I
Right.
also see a lot of evidence of human uniqueness and exceptionalism, if you will. And so I think I would have been better to just own that instead of
Yeah.
just try to subtly justify it without saying, because it can be made to sound like, oh, that's a crazy anthropomorphic kind of point of view. But when we get down to it, I think we all think that human beings are special. And when we
Yeah.
lose that view, we lapse into something like, a form of I'm an environmentalist, but there's a radical form of environmentalist that is essentially a form of earth worship, which is misanthropic.
Hmm.
And Eric Pianka at the University of Texas, who says that 90% of humans should commit suicide so we can save the planet.
Right.
No, I'm not going there. I think that humans, I think the planet was created by God to provide resources for human flourishing. Obviously,
It,
we have to take care of it, but for the purpose of making human life better, not just for the purpose of worshiping the earth for its own sake.
it's interesting as well because he brought up the idea of aliens as a response to that. And in doing so, I could see this same motif coming out, which is, yeah, but what about what if there's something else? And it's like, well, maybe, but we don't know yet. We don't really have like actual hard proof of aliens. So if that happens, then we'll like contend with that when we do. But for the time being, it appears that human beings are clearly the pinnacle of creation. And I like that you kind of just said that you're agnostic about the possibility of extraterrestrial life, because I agree with you. I don't think that it necessarily contradicts a biblical worldview.
No,
Uh,
no. God might have made other creatures in His image on some other star system, and we don't know them or know their story or whatever. I don't think. I mean, C.S. Lewis wrote a whole space trilogy of series of novels based on that premise, and I don't think a lot turns on it religiously. But what we know is that we are on a privileged planet, and as far as we know, we're the only form of life that has the form of cognition that we have, and uh, it's a wonderful thing to be a human being, and we should prize every one of them that is privileged to be born on this planet.
well, Dr. Meyer, I would love to have another conversation with you on this privileged planet. But for today, our time is out. I really appreciate all your insight and everything else. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to talk.